Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Will.
How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on this edition of Free Will.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on, Kerry, award-winning journalist.
Thank you. Sadly, this may be the last edition of Free Will that we broadcast from beautiful LeDroit Park.
It is. It is like our last broadcast. Well, I guess unlike our last broadcast, I think last time I was in the kitchen and you were in the living room. Now I'm in the living room and you're in the kitchen. The tables have turned.
We're completely different people.
We're completely different people. Yeah. Well, why would this be our last broadcast from the historic LeDroit Park?
Our next broadcast will be from Iowa City, Iowa, where we are moving in August.
That's crazy.
It is.
Why would we move to Iowa?
Voluntarily. I will be attending an MFA program in Iowa City, and you've been kind enough to agree to come with me.
Yeah, I know a good thing when I got it. We're going to be in Iowa City. Kerry's going to be doing creative writing. I'm going to be doing blogging heads, I guess, mostly, and working for the Cato Institute. And walking our dog, which we've yet to buy, but we're both very excited about.
It's number one on the priority list.
Number one on the priority list, our dog. Yeah. For those of you who are naturally concerned, our house in Iowa City is not underwater. And we both deeply regret that we were not in Iowa City to take part in the flood mitigation efforts, because we're both people who are, I don't know, just full of civic spirit, I guess.
We'll be there for the next 500-year flood. I think there have been 2 in the last 10 years, so...
I'd like to apologize to the viewers for just talking into a telephone. This is like the 36th time that we've tried to do this today, Kerry?
It's been a long, long day.
It's caused me a lot of stress. Kerry doesn't appreciate it when I become angry, and I have become angry. Mm-hmm. And the upshot is that for some reason I have to talk into the phone in order for this to work. But
I scored because I got the headpiece, so...
She got the headpiece. Also, for some reason, I look like a homeless person today. Instead of my regular dapper professional self, I am unshaven and dirty. But what can you do? It's Saturday.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, Kerry, the reason that I wanted to have you on, besides the fact that you are an award-winning journalist, everybody should know that Kerry won an award from the LA Press Club for the best investigative article in a magazine. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm among the finest reporters in Southern California.
Yeah, there's through a strange twist of circumstance, Reason Magazine is officially published in Los Angeles, and so is eligible for these press awards on the West Coast. So Kerry is one of the most distinguished journalists in Southern California.
In the opposite side of the country, yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But everybody should go read that article. What was the title of that article, Kerry?
I believe it was something completely bland, like Who Owns Your Body Parts, which is a little more descriptive than I prefer my titles to be, but there you go.
That's right. Who owns your body parts?
I don't think anyone has read that particular article yet, except for this committee. So, we should link to that or something.
Well, they've validated it, and everyone should read it.
I'm glad that, those 5 people have read it.
It's been vetted as deserving of attention. Yeah. So people should attend to it. It'll appear on the sidebar next to the Blogging Heads TV screen on our high-tech interface that has been assembled for your pleasure. Well, Kerry, let's talk about your latest endeavor. It's yet to win an award, but it might.
My latest piece is a Reason story called Baby Bust, and it is about natalist policy globally, less how effective it is, because that's really a completely different article, but more what motivates it, fertility panics throughout history, and whether people are right to worry.
So what's natalist policy?
Natalist policy is essentially the use of state resources to encourage women to use their bodies in a particular way, in this case, to be mothers. And we see this, it has sort of a fascist sound to it, but the way it's manifested is pretty anodyne at this point. Australian baby bonuses and social support programs, free daycare in Sweden, things like that, that are programs that are explicitly for increasing the birth rate. Baby bonuses would be the best example. And certainly not as nefarious as they might have been in the past, but I think there are still some disturbing implications.
So let's go in a little bit deeper about what these sorts of policies are. So do we have them already here in the United States of America?
I mean, there are certain policies that you might interpret that way, of child tax credits and that sort of thing, but we have a pretty pronatalist culture in this country, but not so much policy, certainly nothing akin to what, say, Israel or Singapore have, or Sweden, or Australia.
So explain that. So what does... I know your piece starts with an anecdote about, what was the guy's name? Dr. Love?
Dr. Love.
Dr. Love.
He's kind of positioned himself as the Singaporean sex doctor. He wants to loosen up the Singaporean people, increase the birth rate by teaching them that sex isn't something to be afraid of. It's all about kind of trying to forcibly relax the Singaporean people. You know, in Singapore they have like sort of a program for spontaneity in which we will all decide we're going to be spontaneous the same day. It's that kind of idea, and it certainly doesn't work. And we see this...
Planned spontaneity doesn't work?
Apparently. But we see there are interesting patterns. Some of the lowest birth rates in the world you see in Asian countries like Japan, and Hong Kong, not a country, but Hong Kong, Singapore. And one hypothesis, it maybe probably doesn't work in all cases, none of the hypotheses about fertility do, but one idea is that it's quite difficult in Singapore to occupy both the space of mother and the space of a career woman. You have to choose. Where in some place like Sweden, which has quite a high birth rate for a developed country, there isn't this dichotomy. You can conceivably do both, and the state does a lot to try to support that. But culturally, it's quite hard in Singapore and Japan, I think, to juggle a family and work life, because you will be looked down upon as, you know, not quite an acceptable mother. And that might be one reason that birth rates are particularly low in those countries.
That's interesting. I'm interested in that. So why does it seem like there's a trade-off? I mean, is it though? I mean, the way I've heard this said before is there's like this a mismatch between the women have changing expectations. So women kind of expect that they can have a career now, which wasn't always the case in the past. But men's expectations haven't changed that much. So they expect to have a somewhat subservient wife who does all the domestic labor, takes care of the children. And so you get this mismatch in expectations between men and women, and that has, you know, some sort of bad effect on, I don't know, bad effect, but a negative effect on birth rates.
I'm sure that's part of it. I wouldn't put it quite that way. The way I've kind of thought about it as I've been doing the research is that you have a mismatch between the economy and the social norms. So you have a quite modern economy in which you've got a significant portion of women in the workforce, and they're making a lot of money, and they can buy various consumer products from which they can accrue status. But the social norms haven't really changed as far as the position of women in the home and that sort of thing. So I guess I'm saying the same thing. But we don't see natalist problems in countries that haven't, or we don't see as low birth rates certainly in countries that don't have modern economies. Although one of the things I talk about in the article is the fact that in countries like Bangladesh, very poor countries, the birth rates are still falling, and social scientists and demographers really don't know why that is. Certain undeveloped countries in Africa, it's kind of a mystery, and it confounds a lot of this sort of straight economic theories about falling birth rates, because, you know, naturally we all want to say, well, obviously this is an issue of opportunity cost. Mm-hmm. Women aren't having children because they have the option of being in the workforce and to make a significant amount of money. But that doesn't really explain a lot of the falling birth rates we find around the world.
So, I mean, a lot of people have these sort of comprehensive, unified theories of declining fertility, and none of them work. None of them account for all the cases.
Yeah, there was a study in the 60s where they tried to explain falling birth rates or accrued data from all over, had all of these specialists look at it, labor specialists, economists, people who were studying norms and patterns. The only pattern they could find for falling birth rates, this was a European study, was in language groups. If your neighbors, the people you shared language with, were having fewer children, you were much, much, much more likely to have fewer children, and that effect swamped anything else. And that's not very helpful. I mean, when you think about it, this is cultural, well, that's kind of question-begging. But that kind of vague answer is really the only answer that accommodates the data at this point.
So the idea that just as a general rule, as people get wealthier, their fertility goes down, that's not true?
Oh, it is. I mean, in a very broad sense, that's absolutely true. There's no question that as countries develop, birth rates go down. But that doesn't really help us when we're looking at developed countries, trying to explain the difference, for instance, between Canada and the United States. In the United States, white women have a total fertility rate, meaning when they complete fertility, they will typically have 1.8 children. And in Canada, I don't know exactly what it is, but it might be something like 1.3, 1.5. It's significantly lower. And we don't really have a good explanation for that. Japan is a wealthy society in which a woman gives up an awful lot to have a child. Why are birth rates so low there relative to here? Things like that. The neoclassical explanation isn't that helpful there.
Well, it's that there are more Mormons here.
Well, that definitely helps, yeah.
Yeah. I like that. That's one of those factoids that you often hear, that Utah has a higher birth rate than like Bangladesh.
That's right. It does.
That little picture of the beehive on the Utah State logo is they mean it.
Appropriate.
Yeah. Well, so what kind of where is the fertility highest? I mean, who's I mean, because a lot of the
highest fertility ever, I think, was recorded by American Anabaptists, and that was something like 12. Yeah, I think the highest now I could be wrong, but it might be a place like Yemen.
Yeah.
And around like 8. I'm not really sure. But because I was really focusing on fertility panic, and we see that more in places like the places I was mentioning before. Also, more traditional societies in Europe have very low birth rates. Greece, Italy, places like that.
Yeah. Okay. So it's true as a general fact that as incomes go up, fertility goes down, and that's easy to account for using a sort of a basic economic framework. Which is that income is to some sense a substitute for the security that you get from children, right? So anything that would reduce your uncertainty about your ability to support yourself in later age should reduce fertility. So, like, a lot of times people are having kids as a kind of insurance policy, and if you have to have a lot of kids to make sure that there's somebody there who's going to take care of you, then people have a lot of kids. The more income people have, the more you can just take care of yourself. You don't have you don't have to depend on intra-family altruism. You can just buy services for yourself, and so income goes up. That sort of displaces some children.
That's right, and wealth brings with it more opportunities for women in a very straightforward, obvious way, and
then it also
you simply have other options. Right, there's the opportunity cost. The simple fact that you have other options, and that women who are don't feel particularly maternal have another path to choose.
Yeah, so there's two really obvious mechanisms involved with rising income.
Right.
One, the ability to self-insure increases, which decreases the motive to have children as a kind of insurance. And then second, it just increases the opportunity cost to childbearing. When labor market returns are higher, you've got more to lose by staying out of the labor market. But that only gets you so far. because within lots of wealthier countries, there's this huge amounts of variation. Right? That was the
right,
part
exactly.
of the point. And so part of the question, and I guess the variation is within a span that really interests people, because people are really interested in the difference between
it's interesting. 2.1 is always considered, 2.1, you're fine. This is the replacement rate. But it's not clear when you start thinking about it why the replacement rate ought to be optimal. I mean, it shouldn't be obvious that we have the perfect number of people right now, or that we don't want more or fewer. But people are really just comfortable with stability, and people really freak out when that number goes negative. Even if, we can deal with we know we can deal with gradual population growth. We've been doing that for a very, very long time. But gradual decline tends to freak people out. And I think there's more than this sort of very practical concern about pension systems and redistribution schemes that are built on worker-to-retiree ratios. I think that this kind of changes people's perception about the meaningfulness of their collective, of their polity, and so people just start getting very nervous about, being extinguished, that kind of thing. Especially since people tend to have very genetic conceptions, you might say, of their culture. They tend to think of it as something that's passed down through their children.
Yeah. So people will. And you point out how arbitrary this is, and I agree with you. So people have an idea, kind of a particular culture or a particular society as a kind of like a living thing, like it's like a colony of spores, and it's either growing or it's shrinking, and growing is a sign of vitality, and if it's shrinking, that's it's becoming sort of like enervated. It's sort of like we're losing our will to live as a culture, right? If the sort of this
something must be sick. If women aren't having children, something is wrong, and we must diagnose it and fix it. I think that's the attitude you see a lot of the time. Interestingly, we've moved away. Pro-natalist policies, at least, there's one wonderful paper on how we've moved away from sort of an ethno-cultural view of society and pro-natalist policies toward one that's more inclusive but quite nationalistic. So, for instance, in Singapore, you used to only have natalist policies for college graduates. That was, sort of birth incentives for college graduates. That was implicitly a way to say the Chinese majority, since the vast majority of people who graduate from college are Chinese, is eligible for these. Those are the people we want to be breeding because we're quite afraid of being taken over by Malaysians. In Israel, you had natalist policies, incentives that were available to the families of veterans, which was a way of excluding Arabs. Both of those policies have been softened and modified and become more inclusive. And I think we've actually talked about before, or I'm not sure if this was on camera or off, but the way that nationalism can often be a good thing for minorities. And if within your community it's all about, here we are, I'm one of you, the out-group is out there, but in here we're all Americans or we're all Singaporeans. And this is an example of that. But, so we've seen...
that's really, really interesting in this context. Because, that gets to this deep issue about how you're going to draw the lines around the relevant communities. So with the advent of a lot of nation states, a lot of the European nation states, there's nothing natural about, Frenchness or Germanness, right? Like what you had in those regions was a bunch of sort of very distinctive local communities with these provinces with their local cultures and their local identities. People would very strongly identify with being from Breton or something like that. Even when you read when I read Kant, right? People think of Kant as German. but he's from Königsberg, but that's part of like Poland now. I mean, so like where these lines got drawn isn't. There's nothing quite natural about them.
Sure.
All these
when my grandparents came to the United States, they weren't Italian; they were from Sorrento, and it's this sort of national identity is something that starts to seem so natural, but of course is artificial, which is something we hit on every time we're on Blogging Heads. I think that's at the root of these concerns. I mean, that's the question. Yeah. Who is going to be part of the population that I want to further?
Yeah. Well, but I think there's like a really another point about that I want to like draw out is that with the advent of these various sort of large nation states, I mean, most of them have had a specific agenda to propagandize the people who fall under the jurisdiction of the new state, to develop a distinctive national identity that kind of wipes out the distinctiveness of their more local identities. And as you were mentioning, that can sometimes be good for minorities who've been historically discriminated against, because then they can appeal to the new shared identity that's being imposed on everyone, and they can say,
right.
I'm just as good.
So in Singapore, you had a matchmaking agency for college graduates, and Malaysians said, hello, this is really unacceptable and clearly racist. Now there is a lesser state-run matchmaking agency for high school graduates. And this is an attempt to sort of smooth over those differences. It's not equal by any means, but it's more inclusive, and so the policy becomes just sort of overtly nationalist rather than oriented specifically toward a particular ethnic group that you are afraid will recede.
Yeah, and if you're going to sort of wipe out these more sort of local identities over time in terms of the national identity, then that partly just helps you see that there's nothing really natural or final about the national level of identity either.
Yeah.
So a lot of American natalists are specifically concerned about the effect of Mexican immigrants on American culture. But why not have a North American culture, right? That's broader than the American culture and the Mexican culture, in the same way that the French culture is broader than the culture of Breton and Normandy, right? I mean, or whatever these provinces are.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're being a bit glib. There's clearly a reason making a transition to a smaller population, given that if we take out the possibility of a North American Union, which you and I would be very excited about, making a transition to a smaller society can indeed be painful. I don't think it's going to be a disaster, but you have to tear down public schools and reallocate resources and change your Social Security scheme, et cetera, et cetera. So the question becomes, then, what are the costs associated, and I'm not talking about monetarily, but what are the costs associated with promoting one way of, one ideal of womanhood as part of your social policy? And that's something I kind of tried to grapple with a little bit, and I kind of got into, there's this, in sociology they talk about women as boundary markers, and whereas you as the woman, or as the collective women, it is your job to represent the cultural ideals of the state. So men go off and fight and they get dirty and they're impure, but you are supposed to embody everything that has meaning for us as a community. And part of the way you do that is by reproducing and ensuring the bloodline, that sort of thing. So there's a huge temptation to encourage this this particular way of orienting what it means to be a woman. And the costs are, of course, related to norms. In a way, norms restrict freedom as it is lived.
I've really noticed that whenever you talk to someone who is in favor of natalist policies, they can be sort of dramatic things or just sort of fairly mild things like larger sort of tax credits for children, but whatever you're doing, like, so whatever incentive that you're offering to So if you're going to reward people financially for having children, or you're going to offer subsidies that reduce the cost of raising children, the whole idea is to change the relative price of the choice of having children so that it's more favorable. And the reason that you're trying to change the relative price is because you're trying to change behavior. You're trying to push women into choosing to have more children. And when you're doing that, I've noticed, people who defend doing that, I've noticed a tendency to resist the idea that there's really anything objectionable about it at all. That really women want to be having more children, right?
Yeah.
So if we're reducing the cost for them, all we're doing is making it easier for women to do what they really want and what makes women really happy.
Sure, and if we gave women $1 million each to bear a child, we would find that they really want to have children, and then all of our assumptions would be obviously correct. I think there's a wonderful paper by Larissa Reminick. It's a study of infertile women in Israel. Israel is one of the most pronatal societies in the world. And it's the stigma of infertility in a society that has become explicitly pronatalist is just unbelievably crushing. None of these women, there's 26 women who are interviewed, none of them can even conceive of a woman who doesn't want childlessness. They don't think it's possible, or it must be some psychological problem.
The 26 women who are interviewed are themselves...
They're infertile, sorry.
They're infertile, right, yeah.
And it's actually worse in an age where we have fertility treatment. Israel has more fertility clinics per capita than any other country in the world. And because rather than just saying, like, I can't have children, I'm childless, suddenly it becomes a project. Well, the state will give you as many IVF cycles as you would like. And so it's never, I'm childless, it's always, we haven't yet had children. And it becomes this thing that you must orient your entire life toward. And
you can't reconcile yourself to being infertile and just say, I'm going to do something else. The state kind of insists,
the state's not insisting. The state's not insisting. The state's just saying, if you'd like to, it's free. And your women friends are saying, so what's the objection? And it's not coercive. And yet the idea that these women are free to choose childlessness, there's something not quite right about that.
Yeah. So, you gestured just a second ago to the idea that, like, if we gave women $1 million per child, then their demand for children would go away. That's an economist's point that desired fertility doesn't mean anything in the absence of a budget constraint, right? So, my demand for television sets depends on how much television sets cost, and my demand for cars depends on how much cars cost. So,
the reason this is an issue is because in Europe they do all these surveys, and women always say they want 2 children. They always say that, and women in Germany are having some 1.3 or some children, but they still say they want 2 children. And so you get demographers saying, well, we have to do something about this. Women want 2. We have to help them have 2. And that's not completely crazy, but it's got the problems we were just talking about. And also, it's possible that we all grow up thinking about nuclear families with 1 boy and 1 girl. And it's easy to just kind of mindlessly say, oh, I want 1 boy and 1 girl, before you have really thought about the costs or have lived the costs.
So when you ask people what their desired fertility is, their avowal is going to basically, it's going to represent their idea of what's normative given their upbringing, but they're not going to actually tell you how many they want given the actual cost, because they reveal that in their behavior. So what people really want given the real cost is how many they actually have, So there's a question about whether that avowed desire for 2 or 3 or whatever it is, which they might have just gotten from having grown up in a family of 3 kids. Well, I grew up in a family of 3 kids. I want to have at least 2.
Yeah.
there's a question about how to take how seriously to take that question, especially if you're going to use people's answers to that question as your baseline for how to adjust the relative price. So if you're saying, well, if people are really want 2, but they're only having 1.5, then we need to find ways of lowering the cost so that they get what they want. That may or may not be just like a fundamental mistake.
Yeah, it's unclear. The other thing is that we see fertility panics rise and fall throughout history, and we just might be in a period where fertility is just particularly low for some reason, and we'll get over that as we become more wealthy. Or we might just be in a time of panic that will abate. So it's not clear to me that... Well, what a lot of demographers want to say is that, well, look at this trend line. Clearly, we're going to go down to 0 and we'll all be obliterated. We need to do something about it now. It's not clear to me that those trend lines are going to continue forever, but, they might. Mm-hmm. And, if I were going to say why I thought the changing age structure of a culture might be a problem, I don't present it as, a disastrous problem in the article, but if I were going to kind of play Tyrone to my Tyler, I would say something like, well, look at Arizona. Arizona is a place where you have all of these retirees moving in. Mm-hmm. So the age structure has changed. And it's also a place that is undergoing extreme strife right now over immigration, to the point where you have a bill in place, it's a sanctions law that's doing real harm to the economy. Well, and I think part of the reason is that seniors buy houses. Oops. I lost my earpiece for a second. Can you hear me? Okay, I got it.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I've been using my hands excessively in a way that's really not necessary. It's my Italian grandparents. So you've got, in Arizona, you've got all these seniors who move from Iowa. They move from the Midwest. They move from the Northeast. And they want... First of all, they want Arizona to be like a warm Iowa, right? So they're not really into...
paradise.
They're not into cultural change.
Uh-huh.
But also, whereas you or I, if the neighborhood was going downhill, we might move. No, they have bought their homes, and they're not going anywhere. This is where they are for the end. And also, they're getting Social Security checks, so they're not connected to the economy. So when you've got some, young Arizona entrepreneur, and he's all excited about his business and his polo shirt and shorts, and he's talking about how, look, if you pass the sanctions bill, our economy will be completely trashed, and I can show you tax revenues already from this year and how big this problem is, then they don't care, because they're getting Social Security checks. They're not connected to the economy, and yet they can vote, and they're completely invested in what they consider to be the quality of the neighborhood, which might or might not be racist. And they're really easy to scare because, they're old. And so you've got demagogues going into, Leisure World and Sun City and saying, Republicans saying, if you don't vote for me and we don't crack down and send all these people back to Mexico, this place where you decided to spend your last 20 years is going to be, not what you expected. And so that's an instance of age structure really, I think, stopping social progress, which is a legitimate concern, but not the kind of objection you tend to hear from Mark Steins or people who have these sort of or demographic winter, people who have very apocalyptic scenarios.
Yeah, I want to come back to people with apocalyptic scenarios, but
okay.
But I wanted to mention that it's kind of interesting that's. I once had the opportunity to have dinner with Francis Fukuyama, and I ended up arguing with him about whether or not we should be able to live forever. And one of his favorite arguments for why we shouldn't have indefinite life extension is that old people will tend to sort of hoard their power. They also tend to vote more than younger people, but people don't. Older people won't retire. They'll just. Can you imagine if baby boomers who I, as a Gen Xer, am required by a certain kind of unwritten generational law to loathe, and I do. So, can you imagine if, like, baby boomers, like Bill Clinton, if he was like 250 and he didn't have to give up power, would he?
I mean, generation, we
Xers would still be like, oh, when are we going to get our day? And we never do. Well, I mean, but I think there's something important to that there is something, sort of dynamist and innovative about a culture that's full of young people, and that young people tend to be more tolerant, more open to new ideas, more open to persuasion, and so you get a kind of like a
I'm not worried about Bill Gates. If he ceases to be innovative and interesting, then someone younger who will be more competitive than he is. But I'm worried about people who are detached from the economy and aren't going anywhere and are voting.
Yeah. There's a great paper by Javier Saldi Martin and I think Kevin Mulligan about what they call gerontocracy, and which is
great
caused.
Word.
Yeah, it is a great word, and it's just true. And there's two important elements of gerontocracy. One is the decreased opportunity cost of political participation. So old people, the people in Sun City that you visited when you went to Arizona, they don't have a lot else to do, and damn it, don't go vote.
They'll go to town hall meetings.
Yeah, so they vote at massive numbers. So they tend to vote at a rate disproportionate to their portion of the population. But secondarily, and a lot of people I don't think quite grasp how important this is, when people are participating in the economy, they tend to identify with special interests that are protecting their particular sector of the economy. So if you're a steel worker, you're going to be in favor of steel tariffs. If you're an auto worker, you're going to be in favor of certain kinds of protections for union agreements and so on and so forth. But it turns out that a lot of all these different sort of sectoral interests end up balancing each other out. You have different people who are basically fighting for different things in a way that sometimes creates stalemates. When people are working, a lot of their interests are at loggerheads, and that kind of keeps the system in a kind of equilibrium. When people are retired, then their interests in terms of their career, like I was a big fan of the teachers union when I was a teacher. Now I'm not a teacher, I'm just a retired person. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not a steel worker, I'm just a retired person. And all of a sudden you get this giant block of people who are nothing more particular than retired persons. And then they defend their interests as a giant population block very jealously. And so
are we alienating the entire over 65 viewership of Free Will?
I doubt it, because I think every single older person who listens to Free Will and to Blogging Heads TV generally is an exceptionally independent thinker.
Surely.
Mm-hmm. And would not at all be involved in that kind of sort of mass groupthink.
Of course, another way to manipulate the age structure of a society, and generally for good, is to vastly increase legal immigration. That doesn't do anything permanently, because birth rates will coalesce, and the immigrants eventually will also be having 1.7 children or whatever. But it is a way to bring a whole bunch of people into the country who are working age, and that can do wonders. Especially when you've got an aging population of baby boomers. Although, it's tempting for me to argue that we must do this or the economy will collapse, since I certainly believe that the humane thing to do is to vastly increase legal immigration quotas, and also I believe it would be good for the economy. But I just don't think the way, say the makers of demographic winter think, that if we fail to do that, we will see economic collapse. Certainly we can continue or a country like Japan can continue to shrink, and as long as personal productivity continues to rise, incomes will continue to rise. The idea that, the total amount of income going down is a problem it's a way to convince people who don't really understand that this is a disaster, but when you think through it, it's clearly not. You're probably
it's a really complicated question how sort of like population and population density affects growth. Because there's like you're right. There's no reason why a shrinking population per se should cause a decrease in GDP per capita. But there's a point where there's these whole literatures on the importance of, say, urban agglomerations, right? Dense cities and the dense interconnections between people in these cities that seem to have an important effect on creating the innovations that cause increases in labor productivity. So it seems like there might be some case to be made that if you're going to keep getting these same sort of kinds of increases in labor productivity, you're going to need the same kind of sort of fairly dense networks of innovation. And there might be some point at which, if sort of Japan, not anytime soon, because Japan is one of the most innovative places in the world. But if the population starts thinning out enough, they won't be coming up with innovations at the rate that would be necessary to keep up productivity growth, and then at that point, like GDP per capita growth would start going down.
Yeah, we'll see. There are very few countries that are actually shrinking, but I believe Japan and Germany and Germany, I think, is as well. I'm not positive, but I think so. And so we'll see in the next, I don't think 2 years is enough, but maybe the next decade or 20 years if they can continue to prosper individually.
Yeah, well, there's always the robots. Let's go back to the apocalyptic people. There's always robots, and robots are our great hope. So a lot of people are. So Mark Stein, his book was called America Alone. Was that what was it called?
Yeah, it was America Alone. It's really a book about radical Islam more than it is a book about natalism, and it's the numbers don't quite work out. We're not going to see a completely Muslim Europe within a generation, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that instructive a book. No, it's not. It's not even close. Yeah, right. The demographics don't work, but it's certainly a good example of sort of the apocalyptic scenario, and we're all going to lose everything we've built, sort of thing. And I can see that being a possibility way into the future, but I just don't think that we have the numbers to worry about that right now. I just don't feel like it's credible at this point.
Yeah, well, we've had an exchange with a few people online about the question of sort of cultural fragility and sort of the cultural transmission of different. So a lot of what I said, and I just wrote this very sort of flip blog post that was promoting your article, and all I had said was, and I was just I was thinking of something really quick to say so that I could just sort of plug your piece, but not just in a way that didn't say anything about it. And I was saying, it seemed to me that a lot of people who are panicked, who put a lot of stock in demographic questions, are people who are really pessimistic about their ability to make a case for their culture, that they can't actually be persuasive about the benefits and the merits of their culture. And so when they start thinking about the culture war, since they don't think they really have a good case to be made, or at least a case that's persuasive, then they think that the culture war just is the breeding war. And that
I think saying a case to be made is a bit confusing. It's not like I'm going to sit down with someone from Burma and write down a list of pros and cons about my culture. It's more about the possibility of rapid assimilation. And it's also about convergence. And I talked about in a blog post in response to blog posts that were responding to yours, and I can't believe I'm talking about this, but essentially I was saying a lot of changes made at the margin can make for instance, secularization in Europe, can make for what we see as a liberal convergence among a bunch of cultures, and it doesn't really have anything to do with making a case so much as people feeling attracted to your particular way of looking at things. Right.
Yeah, my idea wasn't that, of course, I had actually said, as a manner of speaking, of a culture as an argument. But the point was simply that cultures have demonstration effects, right? The thing that's most persuasive to people is just the show me the money, right?
Right.
And if you have a culture in which people are wealthy, healthy, happy, live a long time, at least one of those things is going to be extremely appealing to almost everyone everywhere. And so if you offer them the alternative, if you offer them parts of this cultural package that are going to help them become healthy, wealthy, happier, longer lived, they'll buy into it. The difficulty for a lot of cultural conservatives around the world is that a lot of this is a package deal. You can't really get the high rates of growth from sort of liberal capitalism without some of the cultural ferment that you get with it.
Yeah.
And so the just incredible pull of just wealth and health and longevity sort of just kind of keeps people making choices on the margin that over time end up changing their culture into a culture that's more like the Western liberal democratic cultures, Western liberal democratic market cultures. That doesn't mean that all these, that doesn't mean that Singapore is democratic, or that doesn't mean that a lot of that, the People's Republic of China or whatever it is a liberal paradise. But there's all sorts of choices that are being made there, on the margin that's causing that system to converge both economically and culturally with our own, I think, in important ways. And so that's what I mean. And at the same time, there's a lot of, say, like radical fundamentalist Muslims like Osama bin Laden who I don't think are wrong to see the Western economic and cultural model as an existential threat. And it's not because we are outbreeding anyone. It's simply because the way that our system delivers the goods is so appealing that it's very difficult for people not to choose to adopt it.
Yeah, I think you put it once as, what is the Taliban afraid of? Why do they have to cut off all communication and keep people in relative ignorance? And surely it's because the pull of contact with this culture is appealing in the way that contact with their culture probably isn't from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think when you start thinking about it that way, the question about which population has what fertility rate actually seems just sort of strangely secondary or tertiary. How many French people are there? I don't know, not that many in terms of the total world population, but the French have had a huge impact on world culture overall. And so the draw of your ideas that come out of your culture or the products that your culture creates, film, music, and most importantly, just ideas, isn't limited to the number of people who happen to share the genes of the people who created those ideas or those cultural products.
Right. Should we move on to some of the other topics we wanted to talk about?
Well, you've been doing all week long, Kerry. You've been dominating the opinion page on the Los Angeles Times online. You've been having a discussion with Kay Heimowitz.
I don't know if I was dominating anything. Yeah,
you have. It's been every time I go there, it's all about Kerry Howley and Kay Heimowitz of the Manhattan Institute.
Yeah, it's the domination of the KHs. I don't know. I don't really think anyone's reading it. It's probably for the best. It was just a quick back and forth between us about various cultural issues we disagree on. But I wanted to talk about that New York Times article last week about equal parenting, because this is actually related to the fertility stuff in a very tangential way. But there's a wonderful article in, I think it was last week's New York Times.
It was last week, yeah.
Was it? Yeah. About the attempt to parent equally. And
I think it was the week before last.
Yeah, it's like terribly outdated. I'm sorry. But the gist was that your husband isn't necessarily the biggest obstacle, and even if you can both have a massive commitment to this idea of equal parenting, but the culture won't cooperate with you. And so, for instance, your husband can't get the schedule at work he wants because it's not expected that men will have to go home and pick up the kids. And the woman can't kind of chill out and back off and raise the kids as a man would because you are always expected to, for instance, write thank you notes. And so the culture makes demands on you as a woman that he's just never going to pay attention to because it's not part of that particular, of the norms of his gender. Yeah. And this reminds me
the husband doesn't get blamed if his house is a little messy, that kind of thing. And
right,
so it's on her whether or not they agree among themselves that it's on her, right? According to everybody else, it's on her, and she feels that pressure and he doesn't, even if they agree.
So they can both agree that, okay, we are going to have a kind of messy house, but that impacts both of them in wildly different ways. Mm-hmm. And this reminded me of a book I read and didn't really use for the Baby Bust article, but there's a book by Elizabeth Krauss about fertility panic in Italy. And she goes to Italy, she's got one daughter, little girl, and starts hanging out with the mothers, and they all have one kid. And raising this kid is so stressful because it's a marker of status among these women how clean your child is. And so what the mothers do is they dress the kids in white on purpose, just so, like, when they're playing and stuff, you can, your kid's in white and he's clean. I'm the best mother. And so, like, having two kids just ends up seeming, like, so stressful. I mean, I've got to keep this one kid in white, clean all the time.
Yeah.
And the demands from other women are they're huge. They make childbearing and raising a much more stressful endeavor than it might otherwise be.
Well, so sometimes when people are making... so inevitably, when you're going to talk about... the sort of division of labor within the household and taking care of children, people will bring up, just sort of natural differences between men and women, differences in their inclinations and preferences.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people will just say, well, you know what? It's just natural for women to care more about what their kids look like, or to care more about, how, whether they're clean. Or something like, and so this isn't, this is just women just expressing naturally what comes natural to them as women. And the reason that these women are sort of, trashing on one another if their kids have a spot of dirt on their, white pants is just because that's just what women do. How about that? Are you impressed?
Yeah. Well, I think you had a story about scrapbooking, didn't you? About how it is woman's eternal nature to scrapbook?
Well, my sister was telling me this story. My sister is the mother of two teenage boys, and I don't remember whether this was... she now lives in Idaho, where she has returned to school to go to law school. I don't remember if it was in Idaho or where she was previously in the Kansas City area in Missouri, but she had a group of female friends, all of whom were mothers, and they had a scrapbooking club. And they said, Jennifer, you should... Uh-oh, I think my phone just gave out. That's a problem.
Hello?
Kerry?
Well?
Kerry?
Hello?
My phone just died. Hey, Kerry.
Yeah?
Why don't you come in here?
Okay.
We'll just finish the rest of our dialogue sitting in front of the one camera. Won't that be crazy?
Okay, let me pull up a chair.
Yeah. Come on over.
Hey.
See, this is what's been happening to us all day long. I keep having technical problems, and there's no way we're going to start this over. So here, we gotta get towards the middle. So yeah, because they're going to have to cut it off.
Okay.
And so we can't.
Scrapbooking.
So scrapbooking. So as I was saying, isn't this format different? I don't know what they're going to do with it. But we're not starting over, for God's sake.
No.
So she was invited to join her friend's scrapbooking club, and she was like, I don't know if this is for me, blah, blah, blah. But she decided to try it because she's open-minded. And so she goes to the scrapbooking club, and all these women are exhaustively documenting every moment in their children's lives. The first time the kid rides a bicycle unassisted, and there were things that were going on. And Jennifer, it turned out her scrapbook was a little bit sparse, and they're like, where's your son's graduation? and she was like, well, I thought maybe I could just, watch the graduation and really engage in the moment and not have it mediated by a camera. And there's horror that you not record it because they're like, don't you realize how they'll cherish this scrapbook?
Well, clearly your sister is a freak of nature.
Yeah. Well, and so what happened? And later on, she decides to just drop out of the scrapbooking group because she didn't in fact like it. And it was sort of like, don't you love your kids? Right. Now, I'm not sure that the inclination to scrapbook and to competitively scrapbook, because if you made a page in your scrapbook on your own time and not at the scrapbook club, you'd have to bring it in so that all the other mothers could see your labor and ooh and ah over it.
So that's like extra credit?
Yeah, it's sort of like extra credit. But it was, definitely there's this sort of competitive positional component to who is the most completely doting mother. And again, I don't think there's anything natural about that. I think that's just a display status competition where you've got a bunch of women who have made a choice to devote their life to having children rather than to doing something else, and then their ambition just gets channeled into it.
Right. I mean, I think part of the reason this matters is because the obvious solution toward mothers feeling that they have a hard time juggling a career and children, the obvious solution is to outsource more. It's to have your house cleaned and et cetera, to the extent that you can afford it. But that just becomes very difficult when you're considered a bad mother for utilizing daycare or other services that would make your life much easier. This actually reminds me of Deidre McCloskey's book, Crossings, which is the best book I've ever read on gender, because after she gets gender reassignment surgery, she actually has to learn how to be a woman and not in the natural way, because she already really is a woman, but she has to learn the way gender is performed. And she has to learn, one of the more difficult things she talks about is learning the gifting culture, which is all these little social cues that women use to sort of express approval and to make connections. And I found that really actually moving and interesting, because I've always felt kind of bad at performing my gender in that particular way. So everybody's watching who I forgot your birthday, because I always forget birthdays. Yeah. And women aren't allowed to do that.
No,
but this is
something,
kind
of a terrible woman in many ways.
Yeah. No doubt. Well,
I didn't mean to step on your train of thought.
No, that was about it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe we can salvage the rest of this, and this will actually work, and maybe it will have to have ended. But is that the end?
I think that's the end.
Okay, well, this is the end of a series of tragic attempts at dialoguing with Kerry. I guess the next time we'll talk together will be in Iowa City.
We will, and hopefully things will go more smoothly.
Well, I'll see you then.
All right.
Bye, Kerry.
Bye, Will.
Oh, my Lord.